If you imagine 19th century Whitechapel, you will probably picture this district of London's East End in your mind as a slum of cheap working-class terrace housing and low-class lodging houses. A den of extreme poverty and thievery. And that's exactly what it was, becoming still more infamous for the notorious murders attributed to the infamous Jack the Ripper. The streets were as dark and dirty as the fetid air between them, for amongst the overcrowded hovels could be found numerous industries where the poor worked long hard hours and, if not here, the Docklands nearby, employed thousands. Destitute immigrants found accommodation and jobs in the factories and wharfs, and so Whitechapel became synonymous with the working class. These socio-economic factors influenced the character of overcrowded East End housing, the poor labourers and their families suffering to live in districts that were no more than rookeries of vice and crime. Today you will hear a description of Whitechapel, its living conditions and its inhabitants, written in 1861 by an author who originally called his account London Horrors. And for what you are about to discover, horrors would seem a fitting description for the squalid and cramped conditions found in this district, which so many people called home. This genuine report of life in the East End really does make you wonder how people survived a hard life and endless suffering, a situation our author called a national disgrace. This is not the first time we have visited Whitechapel. We have told the history of the district and the remarkable true story of Hooky Alf, a jobbing labourer who, when injured, struggled to find work and fell into poverty. There are many fascinating stories to tell from Whitechapel and, as regular viewers will know, slums were numerous, both in London and Britain's towns and cities, a lot of them well known as settings in novels or infamous for their association with crime. You can find out more about them by visiting the channel page or playlist in the description. Before we move on, please consider clicking the subscribe button for more content like this. If you find this video interesting, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a thumbs up and share it widely with friends and family. Please check out the description to see how you can support the channel and the content we make. If I were writing a partially fancy description of the poverty and wretchedness in a particular district, I should mix the aspects of one street with the aspects of another, and hide my real locality under a very thin veil. I should call Whitechapel by its more appropriate name of Blackchapel, and play with the east of London under the title of St. George's in the Dirt. As this, however, is intended to be a faithful chronicle of what I have seen, what the local clergy and others see every day, and almost every hour, and what everyone else may see in a week's walk about the back streets of London, I give up effect for the sake of truthfulness, and strive to become a plain, matter-of-fact guide. There are many different degrees of social degradation and unavoidable poverty, even in the East. Whitechapel, properly so called, may not be the worst of the many districts in this quarter, but it is undoubtedly bad enough. Taking the broad road from Aldgate Church to Old Whitechapel Church, a thoroughfare in some parts, like the high street of an old-fashioned country town, you may pass on either side about 20 narrow avenues, leading to thousands of closely packed nests, full to overflowing with dirt and misery and rags. Many living signs of the inner life behind the busy shops are always oozing out onto the pavements and into the gutters, for all children in low neighbourhoods that are not taken by the ragged and other charity schools are always living in the streets. They eat in the streets what little they get to eat. They play in the streets in all weathers, and sometimes they have to sleep in the streets. Their fathers and mothers mope in cellars or garrets. Their grandfathers or grandmothers huddle and die in the same miserable dustbins. For families, even unto the third and fourth generation, have often to keep together in these places. But the children dart about the roads with naked muddy feet, slink into corners to play with oyster shells and pieces of broken china, or are found tossing halfpennies under the arches of a railway. The local clergy, those who really throw themselves heart and soul into the labour of educating these outcasts, are daily pained by seeing one or more drop through into the great pit of crime, and by feeling that ragged schools are often of little good unless they can give food as well as instruction, and offer the children some kind of rude probationary home. At the George Yard Ragged School, Whitechapel, conducted by the Reverend Mr. Thornton, and personally superintended by Mr. Holland, they have turned part of an old distillery into one of the most useful and active institutions of this kind in the metropolis, and they are already struggling with these and other difficulties. The secretary, Mr. Lewis, writing January 15th, 1861, says, "We have lately had a number of boys in a most distressing state, homeless, hungry, and almost naked. The teachers and friends have done what they could to help them, and can do no more. Those who teach the ragged band have feeling hearts, and it is painful to lie in one's own bed and feel that there are a number of poor boys wanting even shelter these bitter nights. Should we send them away and they perish in the streets, at our doors certainly would their deaths lie. We have paid for their lodgings at various lodging houses night after night, and now, with this severe weather and the mass of distress it has brought around us, matters have come to such a pass we are compelled to ask the public to lend us a helping hand in our extremity. We have taken a place to shelter them in, and earnestly ask for help to go on. Old boots and shoes, old clothes, old rugs or blankets, rice, potatoes, oatmeal, etc., will be most acceptable. To send these helpless ones adrift is, apart from anything else, to make thieves of them. They have gathered some 400 children, of all ages and of both sexes, and they give them every encouragement to consider the school as their home. They provide a meal of rice on one day, a meal of bread on another, and a meal of soup, if they can, on the third day, and they have taken 8 poor castaways, nobody's children, into the house, and are endeavouring to train them into honest working boys. The stories of destitution, cruelty, and desertion which these outcasts have to tell are more harrowing than 1,000 tragedies. One has lost all traces of his parents, another is a street beggar's orphan, and another owns no parent but a drunken prostitute who kicked him, swore at him, stabbed him in the cheek, and left a scar which he will carry to his grave. He can now find no traces of such a mother, except in the cruel mark upon his face, and is more happy, perhaps, in calling his schoolmaster father than he ever was before in his life. The conductors of this school are anxious to fit up some kind of rough sleeping loft for the children. They dread to let them go out into the black courts and alleys, knowing what dirt and brutality often await them. It requires very little diving behind the houses on either side of the Whitechapel main road to account for this feeling on the part of the ragged school managers. Within a few yards of this refuge is New Court, a nest of thieves filled with broad-featured, rough-haired, ragged women and hulking, leering men who stand in knots, tossing for pennies, or lean against the walls at the entrances of the low courts. The houses present every conceivable aspect of filth and wretchedness. The broken windows are plastered with paper, which rises and falls when the doors of the rooms are opened. The staircases always look upon the court, as there is seldom any street door, and they are steep, winding, and covered with blocks of hard mud. The faces that peer out of the narrow windows are repulsive. Some are the faces of Jews, some of Irish women, and some of sickly-looking infants. The ashes lie in front of the houses, the drainage is thrown out of the windows to swell the heap, and the public privy is like a sentry box, stuck against the pump in a corner of the court. There may be as many families as there are rooms, cellars, and cupboards in a single house. 40 people, perhaps, huddled together in a small dwelling, and if there is not a mixture of different families in one room, it is due to the ceaseless vigilance of the sanitary officer, Inspector Price, in carrying out the Lodging Houses Act. The lowest order of Irish, when they get an opportunity, will take a room and sublet it to as many families as the floor will hold. Inkhorn Court is a fair sample of an Irish colony. The houses are 3 stories high, and there is not a corner unoccupied. Tewkesbury Building is a colony of Dutch Jews, and, if anything, they are a little cleaner than their Christian neighbours. George Yard is an English colony, numbering about 100 families, and Wentworth Street, Crown Court, and Castle Alley have the same character. Their inhabitants are chiefly dock labourers, and their families a class who form one half of the population of this district. A correspondent, Mr. Wilford of Catherine Street East, writing January 10th, 1861, says, "The dock labourers consist of a mixed class of people, English, Irish, Scotch, Germans, and a few French and others. They are employed at times as many as 20,000 to 25,000 labourers in the 5 docks, who are extra men, and about 3,000 or 4,000 permanent men, and at the wharfs below London Bridge there are at times as many as 3,000 men employed, making a total of upwards of 30,000 men employed in the docks and wharfs below Bridge. It is thought at the present time that there are not more than 4,000 or 5,000 who are at work, owing to the adverse winds and the severe frost. The average earnings of thousands of these poor fellows is not more than 7 shillings 6 per week all the year round, so that when there is a great stagnation in the shipping trade, many thousands are almost starved to death. It is a lamentable fact that such is the case at the present time." The other half of the inhabitants in these streets is made up of thieves, costermongers, and stall-keepers, professional beggars, rag dealers, brokers, and small tradesmen. In one court I saw a singular blind labourer who was out of work in consequence of the frost. He got his living by reading the Bible in the street, feeling the raised letters with his hand, and he complained that he could do nothing now because the touch was cold. He staggered over the mud heaps with a thin stick, and disappeared into the dark, cellar-like lower room of a ragged school refuge for outcasts. In some of these repulsive courts the inhabitants cling to a rude love of flowers, and many an unsightly window ledge is fitted up to resemble a garden enclosure, with miniature railings and gates. The rents drawn for the wretched apartments in these courts vary from 9 pence to 4 shillings a week, the average being about 2 shillings a week. This rental often pays for the hire of furniture, consisting of a round table, white with age, a couple of bare wooden chairs, a fender and a poker, often, unfortunately, not wanted except when the parish coals are being sparingly burnt, a turn-up bedstead with a rust-ling bag of straw for a bed, and a very dirty, scanty coverlet. The rent for this accommodation is collected painfully, punctually, and incessantly by small instalments, and unpromising as this class of property looks to the superficial observer, thriving tradesmen are found to farm it in the neighbourhood as middlemen, and in some cases it belongs to important local residents. The Jews have bought a little of it up of late years, perhaps because their colony in this quarter is slowly increasing. The Jewish poor are fewer and better provided for than our poor, and the applications for relief are never made except in cases of extreme distress. They are wonderfully independent and self-supporting, and keep up the ceremonies of their nation under the most adverse circumstances. In a very black, miserable hut in Castle Alley, a poor Jewish woman was burning the 12 months lamp for her deceased mother, although it was only a glimmering wick in a saucer full of rank oil. The female population in these courts and alleys, as usual, forms the greatest social difficulty to be dealt with. Their husbands may be dock labourers, earning, when employed, if on the permanent list, 3 shillings a day, if on the casual list, only 2 shillings 6 a day. Their children, after an education in the streets of the ragged schools, may be drafted off into lucifer match or brush factories, where cheap and juvenile labour is in much demand. But for the woman and the grown-up daughters, although it may be necessary for them to help in maintaining the poor household, there is nothing but ill-paid needlework, which they may never have learnt. Domestic servitude in this neighbourhood, with a few exceptions, is not to be coveted, as there is little more for the local-bred servant than a choice of low gin shops or lower coffee houses. The best-paid occupation appears to be prostitution, and it is a melancholy fact that a nest of bad houses in Angel Alley supported chiefly by the farmers' men who bring the hay and straw to Whitechapel market twice a week, are the cleanest-looking dwellings in the district. The windows have tolerably neat green blinds, the doors have brass plates, and inside the houses there is a comparative comfort, if not plenty, while the wretched virtuous population are starving in black holes or creeping out in the hour of their wildest prosperity to purchase sixpenny worth of refuse meat from the stall opposite the greasy, saw-dusty shambles. The inhabitants of this court of vice know little, at least for a few years, of want and suffering. If their ranks are thinned by death or disease, there are always fresh recruits coming forward, and must be while there are as many houseless women as men, and nothing but low threepenny lodging houses where little or no distinction is made between the sexes. I heard a child in the street, a boy about 8 years of age, telling another boy what a man had given his mother as the price of her shame. The boys and girls are men and women at 10 or 12 years of age. The local clergy are painfully aware of these facts, and they have made an effort with some success to check the evils of prostitution. The indefatigable incumbent of St. Jude's, the Reverend Mr. Thornton, before alluded to, with local assistance, has started a temporary refuge for females in Boar's Head Yard, Petticoat Lane, in the very heart of this melancholy district. The work of this refuge commenced in May 1860. Since that period it appears that 64 young women, mostly fallen, some in danger, nearly all from the neighbourhood, have passed through the institution. Of these, 16 are in situations doing well, 7 have been restored to their friends, 1 is married, 1 has died, 19 have been sent to other institutions, and of the remaining 20, some have left, with approval, to seek an honest living. Some have proved failures, having left soon after admission from dislike of the discipline or other causes, and 8 are now in the refuge, making the total 72. This excellent institution is in some degree self-supporting, the inmates earning money by washing, mangling, and needlework. By this means the cost of each case has been kept down to about 4 shillings a week. The receipts for work are small, in consequence of the constant change of inmates. The institution being designed as a temporary refuge, not as a permanent home. The managers, consisting of a committee of ladies, solicit female clothing, assistance in procuring more work for the inmates, and the inspection of visitors, especially ladies.